Resident Evil has gone through some drastic changes over the last 25 years, with a genre that changes every 5 minutes, and potentially even some different timelines now with the remakes getting involved, but none of them are even close when compared to today's game. Hey everyone, Kane from VividChim here, and today we're looking at Resident Evil 7, the first mainline series game in the Resident Evil franchise to let you see the world through the eyes of the protagonist, even more immersively via VR on the PS4. But for today, we're keeping our faces outside of the Oasis and at a more reasonable distance from our screens so we can effectively dive into the murky waters of Delvey, Louisiana. So sit back, hit that subscribe button if you're feeling extra lovely, and enjoy as we ask Resident Evil 7, how bad can it be? The story of Resident Evil 7 takes place in 2017, amongst the swamps of Louisiana. You play as Ethan Winters, an American systems engineer according to Wikipedia, whatever that actually is, who is drawn to the Baker plantation to find his wife Mia, who was missing for 3 years before contacting Ethan that she was still alive. Ethan, now travelling to the Baker's home, explores the rundown buildings before finding Mia locked up in a cage, and not fully aware of her surroundings. Mia leads Ethan to a dead end before being kidnapped and returning to attack him, now infected and showcasing superhuman strength. After fighting off Mia, Ethan is knocked unconscious and brought to dinner with the Baker family, all of whom are carriers of what they call her gift. After their meal is interrupted, Ethan manages to escape the dinner table, now determined to find a way out of the Baker residence for himself, Mia, and the Baker's daughter Zoe, who is giving Ethan a hand. The story of Resident Evil 7 is a pretty simple one, but it has a few interesting twists and turns that really help carry it alongside a fantastic cast of voice actors, especially that of Jack and Marguerite Baker, both putting on absolutely stellar performances. I found myself more engaged with this game's narrative than I did for most of the franchise combined, because it was actually so grounded and personal. It was a refreshing change of pace. So if you hadn't noticed already, Resident Evil 7 is a first-person game, and a very grimy one at that. Everything is absolutely filthy in this game, covered with all sorts of goo and mold, and this is where the game tends to fall apart, as graphically, this game isn't really that great. It feels pretty outdated, even for a game that's only 3 years old, and while it's not bad by any means, the textures specifically leave a lot to be desired, but the game is actually dark for 90% of it, so it's really whatever. The models are slightly better too, with the molded actually being pretty cool, except for the fact that they're just a rip-off of RE4's regenerators. They have somewhat of a spin to them though, and they have a lot more personality and fit within this game's context, a lot more than some of the others. The layout of this game is perfect for a foray into this new first-person perspective, however. It feels very Resident Evil in the fact that it's a house with a series of other locales being adjacent to it. I like that they stripped down the series back to its fundamental roots while making these drastic changes to the overall presentation, letting modern players experience the feeling that the original Resident Evil could have gotten all those years back. It's small enough to make the player feel claustrophobic and trapped, while being large and expansive enough to keep the flow of the game interesting. The locations also blend together extremely nicely, while still having the familiar Resident Evil tropes. You have your big house, your bioweapon facility, and even a mine for good measure, but there isn't a jarring difference from one to the other that a lot of these games have. No, in Resident Evil 7, they all feel connected and part of the same world. They are all grimy and feel like a natural continuation from one to the other, right to the very end of the game, something that even the best Resident Evil games don't always have. So while the pieces themselves don't necessarily look good, the bigger puzzle that is Resident Evil 7 is one of the most appealing and interesting that the entire franchise has to offer. One of the major criticisms I hear about every Resident Evil game that isn't like the classic titles is that they aren't a true RE game, and 7 had this worse than any other, as they had fans of the classic series and the post-RE4 reboot series shouting this at the top of their lungs, and I personally think it's laughably untrue. Having played 10 of these games now, I honestly believe that Resident Evil 7 is arguably the truest RE experience that you can have in the entire franchise, sans the original classic game, and probably the classic version of 2, but it feels more like a Resident Evil game than 4 ever did, and it feels like a totally different series to 5, 6, and the remake of 3, so I honestly don't know where these criticisms are coming from. This game has all of the DNA that the original game presented in a brand new format, and it excels at it. It has themed keys, it has puzzle locks, it has boss fights, a constant feeling of threat from enemies via a heavy survival horror vibe. It even has an identical shotgun puzzle! The main differences, aside from the obvious perspective shift, is that it doesn't focus on Umbrella or a team or any of the prior lore or characters for that matter. It lets its own story shine first, while slowly unveiling the truth in a very cathartic way, a lot like the first game did. The series, like the viruses it's based on, evolve, and they adapt to survive, and the modern approach of RE7 continues to show the franchise's longevity in an effective manner. The first-person perspective creates for a unique spin on the classic Resident Evil survival horror, with the limited perspective putting an emphasis on the audio design like the first game did. You don't have the luxury of seeing enemies from a distance, and there often isn't even a distance to see them from, which really ratchets up the tension as you try to conserve your precious resources for the boss fights. Speaking of boss fights, this is actually where the game takes an unusual turn in my eyes, as Resident Evil 7 is the only video game that I've ever played where the difficulty of boss fights fluctuate up and down. The first boss fight we have against Mia in the attic is challenging but not too hard. After that is a really easy Jack Baker fight, followed by a very difficult Jack Baker fight. Then we have a stupidly easy fight with Marguerite, followed by an extremely difficult fight against the mutated Marguerite Baker, which took me around 10 attempts. Then we have 2 really easy fights to wrap up the game. It's just kind of weird. The bosses themselves, though, are decent, with some unique and engaging strategies and twists to the usual formula of shoot the glowing eye, though that does still make its contractually obligated appearance. I really enjoyed all of the fights in this game, and I think it might be the best RE game for bosses in general. I can't really think of a single boss in any of the other games that even comes close to the RE7 fights. RE7 also has a really fun and unique mechanic of using videotapes to teach the player certain gameplay features instead of just showing lore. This can range from puzzle solutions to simply teaching a player how to deal with a certain situation, and the best part is they are completely optional for the most part, so if you want to figure stuff out for yourself, you absolutely can, but I'd recommend going through them because they are little fun additions to the game and show you some more context about the setting and characters. Some of them also show my favourite terribly named character ever, Clancy Jarvis. What a man. Hey everyone, actually recording this outro today whilst in the editing section of this video. It's probably a couple of hours before it goes live. Yeah, this is probably the closest to a release that I've ever spoken to you guys. But I'm doing this because I'm very sleep deprived in this video, as you've probably already guessed. And the outro was a total mess of rambling for 8 minutes, so I just wanted to say that Resident Evil 7 is a must-play in this franchise. It's one of the 3 must-play survival horror games that honestly Resident Evil's brought forward, with the original and the remake of 2 being the others in my opinion. It engages the player, it's very immersive, and whilst it's not exactly a nice looking game in any means, it's the kind of game that really draws you in to get genuine cathartic responses to the horror and not just cheap jump scares, although there are a couple of those sprinkled through. And whilst it isn't necessarily a scary game, the way that it uses tension, atmosphere, and limited resources, it's really, really well done, and I definitely think it's worth your time. But anyway, that is just my thoughts on Resident Evil 7. Let me know what you thought down below. I'd love to read it. Subscribe today for future VividChim videos, ring the bell to be notified as soon as it drops, and I'll see you all soon.